You never expect an ordinary afternoon to quietly reshape the way you see your entire life. Asterisk before the story continues. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, and make sure to subscribe to the channel for more real, emotional stories like this. Asterisk that afternoon began like so many others, calm and unremarkable, with me standing alone in the kitchen, waiting for the kettle to heat while the late sun streamed through the window in long, golden streaks, catching dust in the air and turning it into something almost beautiful. The kind of moment you don't appreciate until later, especially when you've reached an age where silence feels less lonely and more meaningful. I didn't hear the door open, but I noticed footsteps behind me, careful and unsure, the way my sister-in-law's son had always walked, as if he didn't want to disturb the world around him. Daniel was in his mid-20s now, no longer a boy, yet still carrying that same hesitant energy I'd known since he was young. When I turned, he stood there with his hands buried in his pockets and his shoulders slightly raised, like someone bracing for something difficult. The kettle's whistle cut through the quiet, sharp and sudden, and it seemed to give him the courage to speak. He asked if I had a moment, his voice steady but weighted, and I gestured for him to sit at the small table near the window. As I poured the hot water, steam rose between us, softening the space and making it feel private, like the house itself was holding its breath. I told him he looked like he was carrying something heavy, and he admitted he needed to talk to someone who wouldn't judge him. Words that caught me off guard more than I expected. It had been a long time since anyone had seen me as that person, someone safe, someone who listened, and the realization tightened my chest in a way that was both tender and grounding. When I handed him the mug and asked what was on his mind, he hesitated, watching the steam rise as if searching for the right place to begin. The age gap between us didn't matter in that moment because the silence felt thoughtful, not awkward. Finally, he confessed that he felt lost, stuck while everyone else seemed to know where they were headed, surrounded by busy parents and moving lives, unsure where he fit anymore. His honesty stirred something deep inside me, a reminder of my own younger years when I wished someone older would simply sit and help steady my thoughts. And as I listened, I realized this conversation was already becoming more than a simple exchange of words. It was the start of something quietly transformative for both of us. Daniel's words hung in the air between us, heavy but honest, and I let the silence stretch because I could tell he needed space more than answers. He stared into his mug as if the swirling steam might reveal something he'd been searching for, and I could see the conflict in his expression, the quiet frustration of someone who feels behind in a race they never agreed to join. He spoke about watching friends move forward with careers, plans, and confidence, while he felt rooted in place, unsure whether the problem was the world around him or something lacking inside himself. I listened carefully, noticing the way his jaw tightened when he talked about expectations. The unspoken pressure to become someone impressive, someone certain, someone who fit neatly into a future already imagined by others. I told him that feeling lost wasn't a failure, that it was often a sign of growth, of standing at a place where life shifts beneath your feet, and though my voice stayed calm, my words came from years of quiet reflection and choices made without applause. He looked up then, his eyes softer but still clouded, and thanked me for understanding, as if understanding were something rare. That gratitude stirred something unexpected inside me, a realization of how much I had slipped into the background of my own life, defined by usefulness rather than presence. As we talked, the light outside slowly faded, the gold turning to dusk, and the kitchen felt smaller, warmer, like the rest of the world had stepped back to give us room. Daniel admitted he often compared himself to others, measuring his worth against their timelines, and I smiled gently, telling him how human that instinct was, how even those who seemed confident were often pretending their certainty. I reminded him that life wasn't meant to be lived according to borrowed schedules. That purpose unfolds unevenly, and sometimes clarity only comes after long periods of doubt. He laughed quietly at that, the sound carrying a hint of relief. And for the first time, I sensed the tension in his shoulders ease. We drifted into lighter conversation after that, small talk about work, routines, and everyday things. But something fundamental had shifted. The room felt different, not because the problem was solved, but because it had been shared. When Daniel finally stood to leave, he looked steadier than when he arrived, thanking me again with a sincerity that lingered long after he walked out the door. As the house settled back into its familiar sounds, I realized the conversation had changed me too, reminding me that being needed for wisdom rather than obligation was a quiet kind of renewal. I stood alone in the kitchen, holding my mug long after the tea had cooled, aware that whatever had begun that evening was far from finished, and that sometimes the smallest moments open doors you didn't even know were waiting. The days after that evening passed with a subtle shift I couldn't quite explain, as if the house itself carried a quieter awareness of what had been shared. And I found myself replaying Daniel's words while moving through my routines, folding laundry, washing dishes, pausing longer than usual at the kitchen window. I had always believed listening was something you did for others, but I began to realize how deeply it reflected your own unfinished thoughts back at you. When Daniel came by again a week later, his presence felt different, not heavier, but more intentional, like he was no longer just drifting into the room but choosing to be there. We talked more easily this time, and he admitted that our conversation had stayed with him, making him think about how much of his life was shaped by fear of disappointing others rather than by his own desires. I told him that fear had a way of disguising itself as responsibility, and that many people confuse the two for most of their lives. He listened carefully, nodding, his expression thoughtful rather than overwhelmed, and I could sense that something inside him was slowly rearranging itself. As he spoke about feeling trapped by expectations, I recognized echoes of my own past, years spent doing what was necessary, what was expected, what kept everything running smoothly, until those choices became habits and those habits became identity. It struck me then how rarely anyone had asked what I wanted and how rarely I had asked myself. The realization wasn't bitter, just honest and oddly freeing. Daniel talked about wanting to explore different paths, not knowing exactly where they would lead, but knowing he couldn't keep standing still. And I encouraged him to trust that uncertainty didn't mean failure, it meant possibility. The more he spoke, the more confident his voice became, and I saw the quiet determination he'd inherited from his mother beginning to surface. There was no dramatic declaration, no sudden clarity, just a steady acceptance that his life didn't need to look like anyone else's to be valid. When he left that afternoon, I felt an unfamiliar sense of anticipation, not about his future, but about my own. In helping him untangle his doubts, I had loosened something in myself, something that had been tightly knotted for years. I realized that guidance isn't about having all the answers. It's about creating a space where truth feels safe enough to appear. And in that space, both of us were changing quietly and without spectacle, step by step, toward a deeper understanding of who we were becoming. Weeks passed, and the changes in Daniel became more noticeable, not dramatic, but steady, like a tide that slowly reshapes the shoreline without drawing attention to itself. When he visited, there was a calm in his posture and a confidence in the way he spoke, as though he had stopped apologizing for taking up space. One afternoon, he arrived unannounced, standing in the doorway with a thoughtful expression that told me he had been turning something over in his mind for a long time. As we sat at the kitchen table again, the familiar setting now layered with shared history, he admitted that he had been reflecting on the expectations placed on him by family, society, and even himself. He confessed that for years he had been chasing an imagined version of who he was supposed to be, afraid that stepping away from it would mean failure or disappointment. I listened without interrupting, recognizing the courage it took to admit something so vulnerable. When he finished, I told him gently that living for approval can quietly drain the joy from your life, and that choosing your own path doesn't mean rejecting those who care about you. It means honoring yourself. The words seemed to settle into him, and he nodded slowly, as if allowing himself to believe them. In that moment, I realized how much strength comes from being truly heard. Our conversation drifted to his plans, still uncertain, still evolving, but now guided by intention rather than fear. He wasn't searching for perfection anymore, just honesty. As he spoke, I felt a mirror turn toward me, reflecting years of my own quiet sacrifices and the ways I had measured my worth through service rather than self-expression. There was no regret in that recognition, only clarity. I understood that supporting others didn't require erasing myself, and that wisdom gathered through years of living deserved to be voiced, not hidden. When Daniel stood to leave, he thanked me again, not with desperation, but with grounded appreciation, and I sensed that whatever direction he chose next would be his own. After the door closed, the house felt lighter, as though something unspoken had finally been released. I moved through the rooms with a renewed awareness, understanding that change doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it enters quietly, through conversation, through listening, through the courage to say what you've been afraid to admit, and once it does, nothing feels quite the same again. The months that followed unfolded gently, without announcements or milestones, yet everything felt subtly transformed, as if the conversations we'd shared had quietly rearranged the foundations beneath our lives. Daniel continued visiting from time to time, sometimes with news about small decisions he'd made, other times just to sit and talk. And each visit carried a sense of intention that hadn't existed before. He wasn't chasing certainty anymore, but he was learning to trust himself, and that alone changed the way he moved through the world. I noticed it in his posture, in the steadiness of his voice, and in the way his eyes no longer searched the room for approval before speaking. Watching him grow into himself brought a quiet pride I hadn't expected. Not the kind that demands recognition, but the kind that settles warmly in your chest. At the same time, I found myself changing too, though my transformation was more internal. I began paying attention to my own thoughts, my own wants, and the pieces of myself I had set aside over the years in the name of responsibility. I realized that being present for others didn't mean disappearing, and that the wisdom earned through years of living deserves space and voice. One evening, as I sat alone in the living room, listening to the low hum of the house, I reflected on how a single honest conversation had opened a door I didn't even know existed. Daniel's journey toward self-acceptance had mirrored my own quiet awakening, reminding me that growth doesn't belong to one age or one stage of life. When he stopped by one last time before starting a new chapter, his gratitude was calm and sincere, and his smile carried a confidence rooted in self-understanding rather than reassurance. After he left, I stood by the window watching the evening settle in, feeling a sense of completion that wasn't final, but full. I understood then that some connections aren't meant to be dramatic or loud. They're meant to be grounding, shaping us in ways that only become clear with time. The kitchen, the table, the shared silences, all of it had become part of a moment that would stay with me long after the details faded. And as the house returned to its familiar quiet, I felt certain of one thing. Sometimes the most meaningful changes begin not with action, but with listening and in offering that space to someone else. You often find your way back to yourself.